welcome to Meet the Candidate. And my guest for this session is Bill Baxley. He is a candidate for Spokane School District 81, Director Position 4. Welcome.
Oh, thank you.
This is the Get Acquainted conversation. Just starts with where'd you grow up and a little bit about your early education.
Well, I was born and raised in Spokane. I went to Comstock Elementary, which is not
Well, it's not there anymore.
there anymore.
Yeah.
It was interesting. My wife was not from here. One day we were, visiting my mother and driving around the North End. And I'm going, yeah, this is where I went to school. Well, it's been moved, but it was a portable. From there, I went to Sacagawea, 7th and 8th grade, and I was the actual vice president the fall term there. Then I was jerked out of the public system I always knew this was going to happen because, my mother is a very staunch Catholic, and I was off to Gonzaga Prep. I graduated in '72. I actually won an election there as secretary-treasurer. And I got into the U of W and left in the, September of '72. And never really came back to Spokane for the next 43 years. Stayed in Seattle about 19 years, all told. But after I graduated from the U of W, I ended up doing a trip with one of my roommates down through Mexico and Central America. I would have been about 75 going into 76, and we split up in the Yucatan. I went up to Washington, D.C. and got a job at a communications law firm, which was my major at the U with a minor in poli-sci.
What's communications?
Yeah. At the time, it was divided into 4 sections: journalism, radio, TV, theory, and advertising. And I was in the theory section until I found out that it was completely academic and you'd be going to school for...
And you actually wanted to get a job.
Yeah, so I had taken quite a few filmmaking classes and things like that. So I decided to go into the advertising world. So while I was in D.C., I went up to New York and tried to find a job on Madison Avenue, which I was staying with a friend in Connecticut. It was dead August. I'm on these hot subways in a suit and tie. And I got a few bites as a media planner, but I wasn't particularly, interested. Went back to D.C. and then made plans to come back to the West. Stopped in Seattle, went to the communication building, found a job with the Tri-City Herald, actually, selling advertising, but it only lasted a very short time because I had been involved in college with what were called WUSHPIRGs, which were Washington Public Interest Research Groups, kind of a Ralph Nader type thing where you could get credit for checking on whether an industry was polluting a river or not, and so on and so forth. And unbeknownst to me, because I was doing their advertising and publicity and stuff like that, but not attending the meetings with the regents. The regent that was the fly in the ointment for that program was the publisher and owner of the Tri-City Herald. And when I first met him, and he asked me about my experiences, well, what have you done in advertising? So I told him about that, and miraculously, they called me in the next working day, which this was on a Friday. I met him, so I come in Monday, and they go, Mr. Baxley, we're really sorry, but we just don't have enough work to justify here. So I'm sitting in this apartment with this guy that I had met from Wisconsin that had just gotten a job at Hanford. I met him at the Holiday Inn after my interview, and he had just been interviewed, and so we clubbed in on an apartment. So now I'm sitting in an apartment in Richland going, oh, geez,
You need a job.
All of a sudden there's a knock on the door, and I open it, and it's this guy selling teleprompter cable TV. So later that afternoon, I too was selling teleprompter cable TV, but I did that for, that's how I got through the winter and made ends meet and this and that. I was one of these salesmen that knew exactly how many sales to make a day, and then from that point it was, water ski on the...
Although that sounds like a young man.
Well, I was young,
nice
so while I had been staying in Connecticut during the New York job search thing, the father of the guy I was staying with was a teacher, and we had a lot of long talks about education and this and that, and it was something that I thought was very interesting. And I thought that one of my goals was to always be paid to travel. So I thought, well, perhaps I could start making educational media, like This is Israel or This is India. I thought, well, if you're going to do that, you might want to, get a teaching credential and go into a classroom and see what kind of media they're using and what can be done. And this is pre-videotape and all that.
Right.
But they weren't really making good use of slide tape productions, which was something I was fooling around with right before I left the U of W. And so I went and got a teaching credential. I did my student teaching at Roosevelt. And while I was still doing
Back
that,
here in Spokane?
no, Roosevelt in high school in Seattle.
Oh, Roosevelt High School.
Yeah,
Okay.
I did a high school thing.
Okay.
Before I ended up finishing that program, I was doing my student teaching. Before the school year ended, I ended up getting a job with Randy Finley at the Seven Gables Theater chain as their advertising guy. So now I was back in advertising, working for a independent theater chain that was had some art houses. It had 3 theaters in Portland and 6 up in Seattle. And suddenly everything was advertising. What are the trailers, the posters, inside, outside, marquees, blah, blah, blah. If a film did poorly, it was a bad advertising campaign. If it did well, it was a good movie. You never kind of.
Yeah.
But part of that job was calling to negotiate the co-op advertising budgets with, so I had to go in quite early to talk to New York to find out, da-da-da. Anyway, all good things, come to an end. So when that job went south due to circumstances out of my control, it ultimately worked out very well for Finley, and he was a good guy, and so on and so forth. The bottom line was there were no jobs in Seattle. That was the time where if you were an English teacher, which technically I guess I was, because the powers that be aren't aware of the fact, I guess, that communications is a social science as opposed to a humanity. But if they see communication degree, they automatically think journalism, so therefore you're an English teacher and blah, blah, blah. Luckily, I had a minor in poli-sci, because at Roosevelt, the master teacher that I had his English classes taken away, and they'd given him social studies classes, but I was able to teach those as well. So they were laying English teachers off for lack of experience. They had 14.7 years under their belts. That's how bad it was at the time. So I ended up getting a job up in Everett at a private for-profit new idea called Educational Clinics, Inc. And what they did was help dropouts. At the time, in the state of Washington, if you dropped out of school, you could not take a GED until your class had graduated. So if you had left as a sophomore or a junior, you were clicking your heels.
You couldn't take it at 16, just.
No.
Oh,
So
that's not fair.
our power was to lobby the state legislature, actually get a law passed that allowed us to give letters of permission. So what we did is we prepped students for GED passage or to return to school, and then have a constructive activity at exit. So I did that job for, I would say, around 5 years, and then they opened another clinic in Tacoma, and I was the only one that volunteered to go down there because we had a lot of fun up in Everett, and it was a really tight group, and it was sort of like MASH meets Hill Street Blues of education at the time. I mean, they had eliminated all excuses for students to do that they had used when they had problems in school. They could smoke in a classroom. If they swore, it was no big, it was just one of these situations. So I went to Tacoma as a teacher initially to, inculcate the new staff and sort of the ethos of educational clinics, or ECIs as it was known. But in the interim, they in the transition phase of opening the school, they had hired somebody from Portland to be the director or manager of the clinic, but they kind of soured on him. And so I ended up becoming the director. So here I was at the age of about 29, sitting in on these principal, meetings of the principals of big high schools down in Tacoma, which I had heard about because some of the people I met in my college dorm had gone there and so on. So I knew a little bit about it, but they were didn't like the fact that there was some, kid basically taking their dropouts and helping them get along, et cetera, et cetera. So that job lasted for about 8 or 9 years, and when it went, started to implode due to finances and so on and so forth, I realized I hadn't really taken a trip in a while, and I was kind of a traveling guy. When I was in college, for example, my junior and senior years, or actually my sophomore and junior years, during the winter, I did independent studies in Mexico through the German department, if you can get your head around that one.
Okay.
At any rate, so I'd been around, then I had done the Central American thing, and et cetera. So I decided to take a little vacation. And while I was out of town, I was applying for jobs through my roommate, I had pre-done application packets for public schools and so on and so forth.
Very well organized of you.
But yeah, well, education packet at the time was not online. It was about yay big.
Right.
So, I mean, they were lengthy. You could maybe average 2 a day if you were humping, like regular business hours. But the long and the short of it was, I had seen this ad in the Seattle Times that said, wanted, adventure camping tour leaders must have experience U.S. history, geography, demonstrable leadership qualities. And I had sent them a resume. And I did not have a plan for when I was actually going to return, because I had been in Zihuatanejo and so on and so forth. And I just actually thought of relocating to L.A., but I came back up to Seattle just to, see what was going on. And when I walked through the door, my roommate said, look, you got this call from New York. I didn't quite catch, but it's a toll-free number. Had it not been a toll-free number, I wouldn't have called it. It was also about 9:30 at night, so it was 12:30 on the East Coast, but I called this number. I go, it's a good thing you called. Our rep is in Seattle one day only tomorrow. I can put you in at a 1 o'clock meeting. So I go to meet this guy. Now, this dude was from England, and he was one of these guys that was playing Frisbee on the Great Wall of China in the late 60s. I mean, he had been everywhere, done everything crazy. One of the duties I had when I was teaching at the dropout clinic in Everett was I was what was called the employment orientation god. In other words, I was helping these kids find jobs, get grants, join the military, which I was...
Have a plan.
Yeah, have a plan. Oh, God, we were monitored very closely, much more so than, my later experiences in education, which I'll get to in a second. I know I'm being a little verbose, but the long and the short of it is, I got that guy to, cancel the rest of his interviews. I took him out for a night on the town, spilled him back into his room about 4 in the morning after showing him Pioneer Square. And, oh, by the way, do I have a job? And he said, yeah, you got to be in New York 2 days from now. So 2 days later, I was in the backyard of Staten Island learning how to be a tour guide, which I thought would be a laugher job for 1 or 2 years, turned into an 8 or 9 year job. It's where I met my wife, who was one of my passengers. So it was one of these holiday romances gone awry. I ended up going to South Africa in '89. I was actually in Spain at the time in my off season. I had a job lined up in Andorra, but it didn't snow. So I went up to Germany to visit some people, and I was in Berlin, and blah, blah, blah. So I ended up eventually living in South Africa. That's how I ended up in South Africa. Got a job as a teacher, taught geography, ended up becoming the principal of that school for a while. Then in 2000, emigrated back, and I went to work for the LA County Office of Education and became an at-risk specialist.
Well, I'm actually, you have a fascinating life story, but we're running a little long on time.
Well,
and so
you said you wanted to know.
I know, so it's very interesting. So I think I want to bring us back to, how'd you get back to Spokane?
Okay, I retired in 2015 after 15 years working these juvie jails in LA County.
Okay, so you were taking your education background into the jail system.
The county has 3 different programs. One is to keep them out. One is to transition them after they've come out, and I'm talking about being adjudicated.
Right.
And one is being in. Okay, so I started with the middle school in a multi-subject, self-contained classroom with at-risk kids who had been basically expelled. But in California, if you're expelled, you still have to go to school, but you can't go to school in the district. So the county creates these programs to keep you up to speed, and then you apply to get back in when your semester is up, and they always take them back. And sometimes they trade off because there's a lot of little districts, but there's only one unified high school district, and this is up in the Palmdale, Lancaster area. It's called the Antelope Valley. So the long and the short of that is I did that for a number of years, and then I ended up transitioning to one of their camps. And they have several up in the area. So, you know, these are places where the students don't get to go home at night. So I eventually ended up at Challenger, which is a big complex. And most of my students were gang bangers, basically, that were doing their sentence, and I was their English teacher.
Well, you clearly have a whole variety of educational experiences. Why decide in a nice retirement back home to run for a public office?
Yeah, you know, well, when I was at the League of Women's Voters the other night, you know, they asked me that question. It actually occurred to me, I'm not exactly sure why the hell. No, I tried to crack a joke, which didn't come off. I said, at this moment, I'm, you know, wondering that myself, which is kind of like, you know, the professor,
well, actually,
does the name Pavlov ring a bell? No, this was over their heads. But okay, that's neither here nor there. Why am I doing this? Well, I've got time. I've got experience. Yeah. I love Spokane. I mean, obviously, it was always in the back of my mind to relocate here. I know when I was a kid growing up, oh, it's boring. That's while I'm cutting at Spirit Lake, you know, and coming down the hill at Mount Spokane. This is a great place. Yeah. I like this town. I mean, you can find a parking place outside Auntie's if you want to buy a book. It's cool. It's great. I mean, I'm used to driving from, you know, Antelope Valley to Downey for a training session. You know, I mean, it was nothing to me to drive for an hour to get to a job on a crowded freeway or 30 minutes into the country, you know.
So you're back here,
so I'm back and
enjoying life, and and decided to apply your experience to this position.
Well, I mean, you know, I've been playing a lot of golf, and the handicap ain't exactly coming down at the rate that I was, you know, expecting. So I figured maybe I can find something else to do. When I first got back, I volunteered to work with the juvenile courts as what's called a board adjudicator for the diversion board. I did that a couple of years, and so, you know, I kind of kept my hand in. I'm currently employed as a sub for the kids that are in the juvenile detention center, although there's so few of them these days that when they don't really need a sub. They just double up the classes if they're missing a teacher, and the teachers are always there. I mean, it's a very good job, basically. Excellent principal,
program.
Nice guy, good program. Kids are decent, and they do a good job. So the bottom line is, yeah, I believe in citizen governance, and I want to, you know, I have a desire to take part in the civics in action kind of deal, and I've, you know, want to give back, and I think I bring a moderating, common sense sort of viewpoint to an otherwise sort of overloaded toward maybe leaning this way a little bit scenario in education. I know that the unions, you know, are very supportive of we'll call them progressive candidates, I guess. But the bottom line is, I'm you know, I'm unaffiliated. This is a self-funded campaign. I'm not affiliated with either party, and I'm just an average guy that's got 30 plus years of experience teaching very difficult populations and international experience. So I went to the meeting last night, and I mean, I have to say I was very impressed. We've got some excellent people running the show, and I know that one of my opponents, you know, is kind of reluctant. I wouldn't say reluctantly in, but he feels it's his duty to get in because they are losing a lot of experienced people, and he believes that the continuity is important, and I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that sometimes a fresh perspective is not all that
Well, you kind of
line.
already answered that last question, which was you gave several good reasons there for what you bring to the position and why people should vote for Bill Baxley for Spokane School Board.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just finish up where I do have my little list of,
You have your
know,
list, okay.
just unique experiences, which,
Okay.
you know, you've
Yep,
had a
that's for
taste
sure.
of. I've got the time to devote to this, and it's going to take some time, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of those deals. And I feel that I'm an innovative problem solver that can think outside the box, and I've had to, you know, come up with quite a few little innovations in the classrooms where there were lack of resources or this or that to see it through. So, and I think I've got a reasonable sense of humor and bring some common sense level-headedness to an otherwise could be overheated situations. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, well, those are good reasons and a good place to conclude, and thank you for coming in today, Bill.
Thank you. It's appreciation. And like I say, I really do enjoy your work, so keep it up.
Well, thank you.
That's my main reason to check that Saturday paper. I miss Paul Turner, I must say, but he shows up
Yeah.
enough.